As we have been discussing throughout the show, last night wrapped up the Democratic primary debates for 2019, but we wanted to focus for a few minutes on Mr. Joe Biden. He had a good night, in our opinion, but there were some things that might come back to haunt him.
So Team Rising is here to weigh in. Joe McClain, he's a Democratic strategist, and Inez Stepman is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Two great friends of the show.
Great to see you guys.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
All right, so this moment immediately caught Crystal and I's eye. It may not sink him in the primary. I'm going to hear it. If he's the nominee, we're going to hear this stupid sound every goddamn day of the general election. Let's take a listen.
Lately, Vice President Biden, I'd like to ask you, 3 consecutive American presidents have enjoyed stints of explosive economic growth due to a boom in oil and natural gas production. As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes.
Not the way you answer that question, Joe. That is Hillary coal mining. We got to put coal miners out of work level bad, in my opinion. How's he going to recover from that one?
Well, he's gonna have to go back and say, what I meant was we will create hundreds of thousands of new jobs in emerging industries under the Green New Deal. That's what he's saying. And frankly, it's already happening. I mean, if you look at the wind and solar industries, you know, they are creating new jobs. And Volkswagen just announced a new battery plant in Michigan, and you know, no, it wasn't Volkswagen, it was Ford, I think. But anyway, these green new jobs are coming. They're already online. They're already in the pipeline. It's happening. And it, frankly, is going to happen whether the government does it or not.
Well, that's the thing, though, is he should have framed it from that answer from the beginning, right?
No, I completely agree. I completely agree.
Like I said, you will hear that every single day in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and I mean, maybe not rightfully so. I mean, we talked about this on last night's panel, but you really just, I mean, not having the political instincts to dodge that one is not good. I mean, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, it wasn't that hard to figure out an answer like Joe's.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this the last time I was on, but Joe Biden, I think, doesn't really understand how some of his answers land in this era versus 10, 20, 30 years ago. But
I don't think that answer ever landed, frankly.
Well, so interestingly...
Yes, I'll put people out of work. Who says that?
This is why, by the way, I think you're seeing this larger trend, and it's interesting because it's not limited to the United States. There was some very interesting survey and polling that came out a couple days ago showing that the left parties, both in the UK and the Democratic Party in the US, are increasingly becoming the party of rich people, right? Which is interesting given the economic message, given the way that socialism is resonating in the Democratic primary this cycle. Still, working class Americans are now gravitating towards the Republican Party, and we saw that obviously with Trump knocking down the blue wall. And the only person who spoke to that, I think, a little bit in the beginning was Andrew Yang saying, you know, we have to understand the underlying circumstances that brought Trump to power. And unless Democrats start to actually think that way, I think that they're going to continue to make bad remarks.
I do want to clarify, at least in the U.S. context, it's white working class people and the multiracial working people of color disproportionately make up the ranks of the working class, and they are still solidly with the Democratic Party. But your point is taken. And Joe, in a way, I think that this is sort of the fundamental question of this election. Do Democrats continue to go in that direction of being a party that is centered around the professional managerial class, mostly white, mostly affluent, with throwing enough sort of identity politics to the black and brown working class to keep them in line? Or do they go back to their roots as the party of the people, trying to bring back in some of those white working class and union voters who left them for Trump?
I'm not sure that's the fault line, Crystal. What concerns me is you have the liberal wing that's pushing what they call Medicare for All, which isn't really, it's really socialized medicine, and big federal programs like free college for everybody, that sort of thing. That's not necessarily rich liberal. Those aren't rich liberal positions.
Agree.
And that plays directly into the Republicans' electoral message, which is they're socialists.
But you
They're
know,
not
Joe,
real Americans.
Let me tell you.
gonna
Hold
say,
on a second.
It's a real problem.
We talked to Tim Murtaugh of the Trump campaign today, and he said, in our view, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders are the same. Their policies are socialist. So it doesn't matter who you run. They called it Barack Obama a socialist. Like, that's always going to be the message. But how do you explain the fact that Bernie Sanders has more crossover support from Trump voters and independents than Joe Biden is?
Because that angry message of we have to change things and make things better for working people resonates with both camps.
Right.
Ideology is never a straight line.
That's
it's
right.
always a circle. And there is a point in that circle for lots of working people where Trump and Sanders meet.
Right, but I mean, that's kind of what you have to square. I mean, 43% of union households voted for Trump. I don't think any Democratic candidate yet, I mean, Bernie, to a certain extent, Andrew Yang, most of all, in that answer really demonstrated that. I mean, Inez, I didn't hear a lot of the message that, like, if you were trying to flip the swing states, I did not hear almost any candidate talk about things in that perspective, except for Yang's answer on impeachment.
Again, I think the breakdown is going to be whether you thought the politics of the last 30 years were acceptable or not. And that's the breakdown on the right. It's the breakdown on the left. And interestingly, actually, Bernie Sanders sounded a lot more like his old self a little bit in this debate, right? Because he had been, in my view, chasing a little bit more of where the sort of woke part of the Democratic Party, I think, is going a little bit more in the AOC direction. He obviously did the rallies with her. This time, he was back on critiquing NAFTA, right, and saying this was not enough of an improvement. And that's a little bit more of sort of that class message. It's interesting to me. You see this with the 1619 Project critiques as well. Yeah. There's a breakdown now between a Marxist analysis that sees class as the primary dividing line in America and the sort of woke part of the party, the identity politics part of the party, the AOC part of the party that wants to blend those two critiques.
AOC, though, because her analysis is fundamentally class-based as well. So I think you misunderstand her approach to politics somewhat. But point taken on Bernie. I mean, that is what his though very much leans into the class-centric approach. I wanted to hear your thoughts, though, Joe, on the path forward for Joe Biden. I mean, do you think that he's in position to win? We're very honest here. We think that if the race was held today, if they started voting today, that he was in position to win. Do you think he holds on to that? What does he need to do?
Oh, I think he absolutely does, and I'll tell you why. All he has to do is be good old Uncle Joe. There is as I travel around the country, and, you know, I do this. I take my taxi cab, greasy spoon, barbershop pole, wherever I go. People are worn out. They're worn out with Trump. They're worn out with the tweets and the ugliness. And they may agree with Trump on lots of policies, but they're just tired of the ugly. And I think all Joe Biden really has to do is just be good old Uncle Joe. And he gets away with a lot. Being a nice guy in this environment covers a multitude of sins, especially if they can't legitimately tag you as a socialist. And I think they're going to try to make that argument. I think it's a harder argument to make with Biden.
Really what's so interesting. We talked about this last night on the panel, Inez, which is that Joe Biden is the only candidate where the Democratic primary electorate who's with him does not agree with him on policy, but is going to vote for him anyway because they view him as most electable. And Crystal and I said this both. You have got to shatter the veneer of electability if you actually want to take him down. And nobody was really able to do that last night. Do you even think it's possible? What is the way that you shatter the veneer of electability for Joe Biden?
I think he might do it himself. And it was really fascinating to me to see him explicitly disavow exactly the appeal that he might actually have that you just brought up, that return to normalcy. He explicitly said, that's not what I'm about, right? I think he might do and say things in this primary in an attempt to chase the left wing of the party that is not going to see him as sincere on policy. But he might do and say things that undermine that message, which is his appeal. And by the way, the second thing that's a chink in that armor is the polls that came out that show that gap that he used to have a big lead over Trump. That gap is closing now. None of the other Democrats are doing well in that poll either against Trump in general. But that it used to be sort of Biden and there was a big gap. It doesn't seem like that gap is as big as it used to be. So if that polling actually goes upside down for him, I think that's a problem.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Stick with us. We'll have more for you after this.